So Trump is a stupid idiot.
It's very hard to think of a clear example of a stupid idiot.
By definition.
Yeah, I mean his firm belief that he knows more than anybody else about every single topic. He even claimed that he knew more about grass than anybody else on Earth.
So it's obvious Trump is only interested in power, and mainly this, that he can perceive himself as the most important person in the world. This narcissism, this toxic narcissism.
Welcome to Špica s Macanom podcast. Has political leadership entered an era where simplicity outperforms substance? And is that simplicity a calculated strategy or a deeper problem? Are social media amplifying shallow thinking or merely exposing it as we scroll, react, and take sides instead of reflecting? What role does education play in all this? And are we still teaching critical thinking or training people to repeat acceptable answers? And ultimately, are idiots really in charge? Or are they a reflection of a society that increasingly rewards certainty, confidence, and the illusion on infallibility? Where is Donald Trump in all of this? I direct my questions today to the well-known Norwegian philosopher and writer Lars Svendsen and political scientist and university professor Enes Kulenović. So Lars, are you obsessed with Trump?
It might appear to be that way. Actually, I'm longing for a time in which I do not have to write about Trump. But the problem is that every single day, he almost forces me to write a new piece about him because he just keeps on delivering the most absurd material that somehow has to be commented on. And I think that, I can write about subtle studies about the sublime or something in more irregular times, but we live in irregular times, and then I think this is actually where I need to have my attention right now, because this is the most important thing that's happening.
Enes, is it right that actually it's the right time for should be right time for philosopher to speak out?
Yeah, the irregular times that Professor Svendsen mentioned is a great time for comedians, right? And I think for philosophers. So we have hopes something to say about certain bizarreness of the world that we live in at the moment. And Trump is sort of a signifier of, or embodiment of, he's not alone, but embodiment of the many bizarreness of the world that we live in. And as always, when you look through the history, it's people with a great sense of humor and people that try to think deep thoughts that have something to say in those times.
And left the note, left the remarks, something
Yes.
written about.
Yes.
So it's interesting that actually, when I was preparing the show, I was trying to remember who was that, who is quoted all the time on social networks regarding idiots, but it's Eco. Actually, Umberto Eco is now famously quoted. Or not directly, they say he paraphrased more or less, but he said this is invasion of idiots. People were before able to discuss it in a coffee shop and not doing any harm. Yeah. Now everybody has a voice on the social networks.
Yeah, of course, the whole informational infrastructure has changed so much. Before there were more gatekeepers, so to speak, but now everybody can reach an audience. And of course, I mentioned this in my book. Are there, in fact, more stupid idiots today than before? But it may simply be the case that they're just more visible.
They're given voices.
Yeah.
They can speak now.
Yeah. So, and of course, this leads to a new world of information that's also politically problematic, because in order to have a sensible democratic conversation, we have to relate to the same reality, at least to some extent. And what happens is more that people have separate realities and take very little cues from each other. And of course, that leads to a great extent to breakdown of the democratic conversation.
And those are the alternative facts, alternative worlds of Donald Trump. Actually, they don't live in the same world we live in.
No, and actually, the reason why I wrote this book, I don't write about it in the book, but the reason was really the gradual breakdown of a friendship. One of my oldest and closest friends got increasingly more entrenched in the weird world of conspiracy theories. And I tried to keep some sort of sensible conversation going. But as time progressed, it became increasingly clear that we were in fact relating to completely different realities, which made genuine communication impossible. We could not talk to each other.
So we
anymore.
cannot even agree about the facts anymore.
No. Of course, one of the defining features of what I refer to as stupid idiots is, of course, that the conclusion overrides any sort of consideration of facts. I mean, they've gotten an answer, and anything that might contradict those beliefs will simply be ruled out as irrelevant or something along those
enemy,
lines.
just enemy.
Or just
they're against us. You're against us.
Just an enemy. I recently formulated this that perhaps what we have entered is not so much a world of post-truth, but rather a kind of regression to a state of pre-truth. What Ernst Cassirer, the German philosopher, referred to as mythic politics, in which one's alliance is the overriding concern, and that cuts a lot deeper than the distinction between truth and falsity.
Yeah, but Enes, how do we handle then in political theory and in political life? You know, how can you tackle it if people are not able to talk to each other? And because democracy is about talking, getting consensus. This is how I see it. At least the Scandinavian ones,
As they say, that's $1 million question, right? But I think there is something new in the sort of the world we live in. Because, I mean, we live in the same world, right? We just interpret it so differently that it seems that we inhabit different worlds. But unfortunately, it's the same world. So when unfortunately someone activates a nuclear bomb, it affects us all. The interpretation doesn't matter there. However, before we always had conflicting interpretations about the world. Think about sort of modernity starting with French Revolution, right? You have reactionaries and progressives or revolutionaries, or in 20th century, different ideological interpretations of the world, like the fascist one, the communist one, the sort of more liberal democratic one. But today, it seems to me, which is maybe unique, is that we have sort of such a plurality of interpretations. There's so many interpretations, as Ars said before, right? On social media, doesn't matter what you believe. The earth is flat, the climate crisis is a hoax. You'll always find someone to support your understanding. So in this plurality, then it brings insecurity and inability anywhere to share enough. There is not enough overlap for us to then say, well, okay, but this is the minimum, right? This is kind of that we can disagree, we can ideologically disagree and see there, but this is kind of a minimum that we share. And it seems to me the unique element of the world that we live today is that minimum that we are supposed to share is not there anymore. And because it's a completely new situation, right? I'm afraid we can't sort of use the old bag of tricks, either from political theory or philosophy. We are faced with trying to find new answers. And I think the books that we're going to refer today from Professor Svendsen, from Lars, are in a way an attempt to try to see how we can answer these questions in a new way, not just relying on the old sort of instruments that we had before.
So big challenge ahead.
Yeah, and these kind of conversations, although as you mentioned, right, we will probably have this conversation at the coffee, right, in the center of town. That's here in the background. But now we're, on the podcast, we're going on the TV, and we're going in the media. So in that sense, we're also part of the problem, and we're trying to be part of the solution.
And it should also, this didn't start with Trump. I mean, Trump accelerated it, but there was this fascinating survey by Pew Research Institute in the US when it studied the 2016 election. And in that election, 4 out of 5 Democratic voters said that they believed that they would not be able to agree with Republican voters in the US about basic facts, not basic values, basic facts. And of course, Republican voters said exactly the same. 4 out of 5 of them said that they would not be able to agree with Democratic voters about basic facts. So what has happened here is really that a polarization of values has led to a polarization of facts, which in turn leads to a democratic breakdown.
Yeah, nobody's talking to anybody anymore.
No.
Just enemies.
Yeah,
not
yeah, and you see, of course, also the decline of trust in the U.S. at the moment. I mean, it's sort of transformed from being this pretty individualistic society to becoming a tribal society with the two main tribes.
And fandom actually.
Yeah.
You know, Donald Trump has a fan base actually, not a voter base.
Yeah, and I mean, if we were to meet as two Americans, I was thinking, can I trust you? First, I'd have to know, do you support Trump or not? Yeah.
Do we talk at all or not? Yeah. Or is there any use talking?
Yeah.
Why do we waste time? Okay, but I would refer to Trump. I would refer to the philosophers and Trump. That one is being translated in Croatian as I find here. But let's finish this one and this one that started everything about stupid idiots and stupid idiots.
Yeah.
So when you write at the beginning of the book, we have that Ricky Gervais famous quote saying, "Remember, when you're dead, you don't know that you're dead. It's only painful for others." The same applies when you are stupid. So who are stupid? Who are idiots? And who are stupid idiots?
Yeah. The short answer is all of us. This book is very democratic in that sense. We are all included in this bad company.
But not all time.
No, and not to the same extent. But of course, the first lines of the book is, "I'm stupid, so are you. I'm also an idiot, so are you." And then I try to explain why. And those first two categories, I think they get off the hook pretty easily in the book, because a stupid person is someone I define as someone who does not use his capacity for thinking, who simply accepts something from some authority or other. He does not think. So stupidity is not thinking, and there's no doubt there. In order to develop from being stupid to becoming an idiot, you have to have gotten some sense of doubt, trying to find your own answers. The problem, of course, with idiots is that they try to think for themselves, but they do so pretty poorly. And that happens to all of us. I mean, they
underperform.
Yeah, there are countless landmines in the world of thought, and we all fall prey to them, especially this confirmation bias, I mean, which leads us astray, that we tend to put so much more faith in whatever supports the beliefs.
Yeah, and social networks are very good in providing that argument to you. Yeah. Okay, there is another idiot confirming this. What I'm saying.
And of course, one of the major problems with idiots is, of course, their incapacity for using their capacity for hearing. They're not listening to others. They tend to rely so much on what Hegel referred to as their inner oracle, this certainty that cannot be shaken by something outside. But then again, you can engage in conversation with someone stupid. You can ask, why do you believe that? Okay, you get a reply, and you reply. The conversation has begun. All is well, as far as I see it, if you manage to get there. The same with idiots. You might ask, well, why do you think that follows from that? You get a reply, and you reply to that. And then the conversation gets going. That conversation will often lead to the insight that you are, in fact, the biggest idiot. But that's a chance you just have to take. What if both parties are idiots? Well, that will also happen frequently, but hopefully they will be so different in their idiocy that they can correct each other. But they have to have some sort of respect for some common ground of discussion. The third category, the stupid idiots, that's where the really big problems start occurring, because with stupid idiots, all doubt is gone again. The stupid idiot is dead certain. He has gotten his conclusions. There's not a shred of doubt. It's impossible to get through in any sense. So with stupid idiots, you simply cannot get the conversation started. You may actually talk to them, or rather, they talk to you, but they don't listen to you.
Yeah, they want to talk to you. They want to sell the idea.
Yeah.
They're very overconfident.
Definitely, and a fascinating feature of stupid idiots is, of course, not only that they are incapable of changing their opinion, they're also incapable of changing the topic. Everything has to be about whatever their particular hobby horse, right? It's without any real communication. So all hope is lost for most stupid idiots, but they may, of course, get a revelation, as we all do from time to time, when we're suddenly struck by this sudden insight. Oh my God, what a stupid idiot I've been. Unfortunately, such revelations are all too rare. Yeah.
Not very often, and
Yeah.
not to everybody. Yeah?
Yeah.
So how do we cope with those? If they are majority, okay, they have voice now. They've been always around, but they have a voice now. They've been, as Echo said, they were in the coffee shops, they were in the bar in Italy, and commenting. They were the most clever guys, the most loudest. But now they have a voice, and then when they get together on a social network, then I think that the good example for these theories is that flatliners. Actually, they don't even want to discuss that with you. You cannot convince them. You cannot show them a picture of the space flight now to moon and show the Earth. And, this is conspiracy theory. So how can we tackle?
Well, I think one possible solution is sort of hinted at the book. And I think the great thing about the book is what already Professor Svendsen mentioned, is that we're all in some way stupid or idiots, or even stupid idiots in some parts of our thinking, right? It's rarely that all of our thinking is done in that way. And there are great examples in the book of great philosophers who are politically extremely stupid, right? Or you can have great artists who are stupid in other ways, in maybe private life and so on. So intelligence as a sort of something that we kind of think is binarily opposite to is not a single concept, right? You can be intelligent in one sphere of your life and not in the other. So maybe one way to reach these people is to try to find something where you think they might not be stupid or idiots, and that's kind of your starting common ground. And because, as I said, I mean, if it's someone who is in every aspect and only wants to keep to one topic, then it's very hard to find the sort of entry to the conversation. But then if you find something, right, you might completely disagree and have a completely different interpretation of the political world, but maybe, discussing your family life or concept of friendship, or maybe art and so on. And that sort of opens maybe the gate that this person starts perceiving you not as an enemy, not as someone who is you're not being able to have a conversation with, but okay, so we have some common ground. And then you can enter the door and see, and then we don't know what's going to happen, but maybe then there is a certain opening where you can kind of try to then start discussing either politics or something.
But how to reach them? Because they ran from the media. Media were gatekeepers. They ran from the media to the social networks. Then they didn't even believe them, and then we got to podcasts. So those people listening to us are usually not listening to anything else. This is the main source of information because they trust you. They trust the source. No matter what you say, they want to watch you every week and get new feed information to go to the bar and talk. Yeah. So how can we reach them when they get informed on very specific locations and they know where they go and they know what they're getting there, and they don't want to try anything else? I'm trying to bridge this. So sometimes I bridge two worlds. I bring people that are not on opposite sides. It's very hard, even I don't know how it's in Norway, to get people of the opposite sides to sit in the same studio and talk. I don't even get them to sit. I managed some, not all the time, and it was always a hit show. But it wasn't a show. It was a great conversation about polarization, for example. People were surprised that people were able to talk like that because they were highly intellectual and they didn't want to confront. They wanted to explain it. But it's so rare. So how can we reach those people?
Well, I think one of the problems that we often kind of don't see clearly is that on social media often there's no dialogue, right? We were mentioning dialogue. It's often just monologue. And you can have an interview here and it might not be a dialogue. It looks like it's a dialogue. People are exchanging different opinions and so on. But the person who came to the studio didn't come to have a dialogue, didn't come to have maybe his opinions challenged. He came to have a monologue, right? Yeah. He came to say what he wanted to say. And in that sense, right, that what I mentioned, right? The idea that you might open a gate by opening some other topics of dialogue, that will not work, because people who came just to have a monologue, right? There are people on social media that just have monologues, and they just want to have, and they're not interested in dialogue, because what they're interested is to get as many followers as possible that will agree and follow their monologue. So that's the first thing. Are you having a monologue or are you having a dialogue? And I'm sure you had guests, right? We're not going to mention any names, that after it finished, you had a feeling that it wasn't really a dialogue. It wasn't really, we were having a coffee and having a conversation, right? But you know that this person came here and used this as a platform to...
send the message.
Yeah, send a message, to have a monologue and use it as a way to reach wider audience for their exclusive opinions.
Lars, what can we do? What can we do?
I think what you're saying is really important, because of course dialogue is something completely different from two monologues having a front collision. I often use the image of a triangle when talking about a dialogue. There's you, there's me, and there's the matter we're discussing. And in a proper dialogue, the subject matter should be our guiding. And of course, in a proper dialogue, we should all enter it, not in order to win, but in order that we may all become slightly wiser. A proper dialogue isn't a zero-sum game. Everybody could become wiser by it. Nobody has to lose a dialogue. But of course, if someone enters that unwilling to adjust anything, they just want to push their agenda, then we're not having a dialogue.
But you said the stupid idiots are actually not listening.
No, they're not. So having a dialogue...
That's why they're dangerous.
Yeah,
right?
and of course, whenever they are confronted with something that does not fit in with their ideas, they will usually just dismiss it. And I mentioned one example in my book that I thought was hilarious, with my friend, the anti-vaxxer, who sent me a report from the National Health Institute not too long after the COVID vaccines had been introduced, and he said, look at this report, 1,500 people who got the vaccine died from it. And I said, wow, that's quite astonishing. I'll have a look at the report, because if that's correct, that's...
it's big news.
Yeah.
Dramatic.
Yeah. So I read the report, and then I had to tell him, well, that's not what the report says. It says that 1,500 people who got the vaccine are in fact dead, and they died from all sorts of causes, heart attacks, traffic accidents, and so on. So of course, having gotten a vaccine and dying is not the same as dying because you got the vaccine. And then I dug a little bit deeper, and the number of people who were likely to have died from the vaccine at that point was in single digits in Norway. So I sent this back to him. And what was fascinating was that this report that he put so much faith in, when he misinterpreted it, when I sent it back to him, he looked at it again, and he had to agree that my interpretation of the report was correct, but then he found it completely without any credibility whatsoever. So because it didn't draw the conclusion he thought it drew, it was not worthy of any trust whatsoever.
It was dismissed.
Yeah, and you will typically notice that, for instance, if you're discussing a medical issue and you say, well, here's this new huge meta-study that has been published in Lancet, the world's leading medical journal. There's quality control in every single part of the process here. It may not turn out to be correct, but one has done the utmost to try to make it as correct as possible. And you present this, well, this is the best we've got at the moment. He will probably send you a link to a YouTube video in which some alternative healer from somewhere who has no scientific merits whatsoever draws a different conclusion, and then arguing, well, these sources are equal. This source is this, and this source is that. But of course, they're not equal. One has been through a process of quality control, and the other hasn't. But that's not relevant.
But this is why the world of fact checkers actually is not working with them.
Yeah,
we can fact check them, but they simply ignore. They continue their work, and they consider fact checkers not relevant.
Fact checking doesn't work on what you described as stupid idiots. Right? The sociologist of religion had this sort of the interesting studies they were making. So the certain religious cult or group would have a certain prophecy, right? And the prophecy doesn't come true, right? The end of the world or the savior coming. And then how they pivot, right? So either the group can dissolve after that because the prophecy didn't work, or you pivot and you give an alternative explanation then. And this is a good example, right? So maybe this report is not saying on the vaccines what he thought he's saying, but then he can pivot and he can say, well, the report itself it was, for him, the report was valid when he thought it confirms what he wanted to confirm. When it doesn't, then he questions the validity of the product. And this is kind of this type of thinking, this confirmation bias that we're all prone. I mean, first studies were done in sort of religious cults and religious groups, right? But it also refers to political thinking, also thinking in science, in philosophy, and so on. Scientists are often also, they have a certain thesis and they go forward and trying to find and confirm. But at the end, there are mechanisms, right? And there are mechanisms like in journalism, and I think fact-checking, although maybe it doesn't always work, but it is important because there are mechanisms where we can try and save ourselves, right? Ourselves from confirmation bias in any sphere, either in politics, in journalism, in science, or philosophy.
Okay, so this is we want the book is translated in Croatian, and there is a new translation coming in, Trump and Philosophers.
Yeah.
And I said to Enes that there was an interesting look at the view through the eyes of Machiavelli on Trump, that we all get surprised that actually Machiavelli gets positive audit than Trump. He passes better than Trump in that.
For the paperback version of the Norwegian edition of this book on stupid idiots, I had to write a bonus chapter entitled "The Stupid Idiots in the White House" because it's hard to think of someone who really checks all major points on being a stupid idiot.
So Trump is a stupid idiot.
It's very hard to think of a clear example of a stupid idiot.
By definition.
Yeah, I mean his firm belief that he knows more than anybody else about every single topic. He even claimed that he knew more about grass than anybody else on Earth. Of course, that's really problematic in a democratic context, because then dissenting voices, they will at best be noise, and at worst they have to be removed, because they stand in the way of the true vision of the one who knows the most and the best about
Is that a cult
everything.
Then?
Sorry?
Is that a religious cult, kind of?
They often, and I think not wrongly so, they often it's described, at least the Trump's inner circle is described as a certain cult.
And
right?
he's recently Jesus now. So.
Yeah.
Yes, and you can see this in for example, Vance or Rubio, who are very critical of him now, right? They, as we know from reports from New York Times, Washington Post, and so, they will sometimes have different, for example, on the war in Iran now, they will have a different consenting opinion. But when they see that Trump doesn't move on that, they will very quickly, then, as cult works, they will very quickly accept the words of the prophet, right?
And of course, he demands it. And
yes, because it's a question also of test of loyalty.
Yeah.
Ultimate loyalty.
Yeah. So I distinguish between three forms of trust. The basic form is naive trust, what we're born into the world with. I mean, you have to trust our parents and so on in order to be able to grow up at all. But then we grow up. And then trust can basically take one out of two forms. It can become blind trust, which is the sort of trust people have in cult leaders that simply cannot be corrected. The leader is infallible. But you could also develop reflective trust, which always contains some mistrust. It's always conditioned. I trust you with regard to this, but not that, and so on. And I think what is fascinating is how authoritarian leaders demand blind trust from their followers, whereas democratic leaders ask for conditioned reflective trust from the citizens. And of course, Trump is definitely in the I demand blind trust category.
And this is where the difference comes from in Machiavelli's point of view to the world. He wanted a republic.
Yeah, I mean, from Machiavelli's perspective, and then of course, so in that book, I gave my opinion on Trump, but then I woke up one morning and I thought, would be really interesting to read what all sorts of philosophers, from Plato to the present day, would have thought about Trump. Well, nobody has written that book, so okay, I'll do it myself. So the basic idea there is, just don't take just my word for it. Let's hear what 40 of the greatest philosopher would have said. 40 would have said about this. And what's interesting is, of course, that none of the 40 philosophers like what they see when they look at Trump, but they dislike it for different reasons. When it comes to Machiavelli, he's probably one of the thinkers who's more positive to Trump, because Trump does not concern himself with real morality or ethics, anything like
just
that.
Just the goal, objectives.
Yeah, sure. And one might then think that, well, Machiavelli is a thinker who would certainly appreciate Trump, but the answer is no. Because what is Machiavelli's real aim? I mean, in The Prince, it's a description of how to gain power and how to maintain power. But in order to maintain power, you have to create stability. And Trump is chaos walking on two legs. To be a good political leader, to be a statesman, for Machiavelli, you have to have what he refers to as virtù, which isn't exactly the same as virtue, but it's capability, political capability, craftsmanship. You have to have a clear mind. You have to be strategic. You cannot simply give way to whatever emotional impulse you have at any given moment, and so on. So Trump would fail as really a poor political craftsman, as someone who fails to provide that stability that is the aim of politics. Of course, when people read about Machiavelli, they usually read about The Prince, but that's not really. I mean, that sort of regime isn't what Machiavelli preferred. He would rather have a republic, which he describes in his other major work, the Discorsi. And again, for instance, how do you create a stable republic? You have to have institutions. Trump is tearing them down. You cannot have too much inequality in a republic, according to Machiavelli. So he goes as far to say that if you want to establish a republic somewhere and there's an aristocracy there, well, you just have to execute them. And what does Trump do? Increases inequality, pushing so much in favor of his political supporters and friends and so on. That would, for Machiavelli, lead to the downfall of a republic. And Trump's very style of ruling is, from a Machiavellian perspective, a regression from the republic to the tyranny that he sees as a lesser political form that he describes in The Prince. So he wouldn't have much nice to say about Trump, all in all, even though he would appreciate the fact that Trump has no genuine concern for morality. He would appreciate that. And the fact that Trump lies so much, he would also...
If approves
he would approve. He would approve some of Trump's methods, but he would definitely not approve of their execution.
Well, I think Machiavelli is very useful here because he, in some way, would approve of Trump or people like Orban. In which way? Because one of the goals of the politics is to get to power and keep yourself in power.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we can say Trump shows some kind of political intelligence. I mean, might sound counterintuitive, but he was successful even after he lost to get back into power and now in keeping power. But that's not the whole story. It's often forgot that Machiavelli has a bigger picture of what politics is about. One is to get yourself in power, but Machiavelli asks, what do you do when you're in power? It's not just keeping if your goal is, and Machiavelli has several historical examples, is just to keep yourself in power, then you're a bad ruler. If you don't have what he calls gloria, there's a bigger vision what you want to do once you have political power. And maybe Viktor Orban, who now lost his power, is a good example here. Here you have a person who is undoubtedly was very skilled keeping himself in power for 16 years, right? But there was no bigger picture, there was no bigger gloria than just keeping yourself in power. Yeah. And at the end, and Machiavelli hints at that, at the end you will probably, not necessarily, but you will probably lose power if you do that. So Machiavelli is useful here because he would say, you can't dismiss this. There are people who are very talented in achieving political goals, probably more talented than some people who have great vision but don't know how to politically act. So if you can't get into the power and can't hold that power, then you're not really playing a political game. And in that sense, he justifies a lot of things for that. And that's why, for example, he discusses Cesare Borgia, who we kind of consider as maybe like an old school Viktor Orban, or maybe less Trump. Yeah. But there is this bigger question of what do you do with political power? And what we see in these, I wouldn't call them statesmen, politicians, they're lacking this idea of what do I do when I'm in power? So it's obvious Trump is only interested in power, and mainly this, that he can perceive himself as the most important person in the world, this narcissism, this toxic narcissism, right? And similar thing you can see in other rulers like Viktor Orban, or not to mention too many names. And Machiavelli then would have a big problem with that. And that's why he decides on the Republic at the end, because he says at the end, when you have one single ruler, he will always at the end, his gloria, his vision will always be more narrow than the vision of the Great Republic. And his ideal, of course, is the Roman Republic and the great gloria of the
But that was
Roman
the America
Republic.
we all looked at before, with institutions, two sources for at least two sources.
Because it was a great political vision, right? How to create with all its bad side. We all were aware of the racism in America and violence, but at the end, the reason why, especially in the 90s, right, when I was a sort of a young student and then became a young assistant, America was sort of an ideal because there was a vision there. There was something making a society where people are truly equal, where people truly can prosper based on maybe their talents and so on. And that vision now is completely collapsing. So I think we're seeing sort of live the collapse of the American Republic. I'm not saying it's going to collapse, right? It might still revive itself, but certainly the American Republic is an ideal, as this kind of what Machiavelli would say, certain gloria, certain vision, political vision that we are trying to fulfill, and sometimes fail, sometimes it's always one step back, but as long as it's two steps forward, you can still sort of see value in this vision, and that doesn't seem to exist anymore in the American Republic.
Time goes quite quickly when we are both talking, and so we are 7 minutes to the end. And is there any other philosopher that you like to see Trump through his eyes?
Oh, I think they're interesting because they have so diverse perspectives. And of course, what some of them see are pretty similar. Both Plato and Aristotle, they see a tyrant ruled by his own passions, when the will becomes the servant of the passions rather than reason and so on. And Plato's description here is of what he calls tyrannic personality. Someone driven by their epitunia or their appetites, and they know no limits. They always want more and so on. And that most people with such a personality, they just become common criminals. It's no big deal, really. But if someone with such a personality becomes the ruler of a state, okay, then we've got problems, because that will also lead the state to becoming a tyranny. And Trump is interesting from a Platonic perspective because he is in a way a caricature of the Platonic philosopher king. So I think that's one interesting perspective. From the perspective of St. Augustine, Trump is someone who has the most corrupted form of love entirely directed towards himself. That is in politics as navel gazing, really, which is, of course, for Augustine, the most decadent form of love. I think lots of them have interesting points. John Locke, for instance, well, what was Locke's project? It was ultimately theological. Locke's liberalism was seen by Locke as the implementation of the will of God on Earth. Yeah. So what Trump is doing, dismantling this whole system, is really opposing God, and which is interesting given the role of religion in the rhetoric of Trump and the MAGA movement and so on. And of course, he's gotten himself into a lot of trouble recent days because of that, with this picture of himself looking remarkably like Jesus. And now he claims that, well, no, he didn't present himself as Jesus, as a Red Cross worker, but he said, but I really do make people better. And you wonder, in what sense does he make people better? And sort of this echo of the medieval king that had this capacity for healing people. But of course, the medieval king who healed people did so only as an instrument of God. Whereas Trump, he's enough in himself. He himself, due to his greatness, can make people better. And of course, then we're into several of the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah, but Enes, are you surprised that he even challenged the Pope?
I was not surprised, right? Well, part of his political rhetoric, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, is this what we call trolling today, right? So that's part of trolling. But also I think he's very, very sensitive because obviously what Pope said before, although he didn't mention Trump's name, was directed towards him. So for him, it doesn't matter if it's Pope or it's some journalist or intellectual or a political opponent, whoever dares to question, and then we're coming back to the cult issue, whoever dares to question there, he will attack him. So it's not terribly surprising, right? But Plato also uses this metaphor of and you mentioned it, a werewolf, right? So the werewolf is one who, once he sort of feels the human flesh, he can't stop, right? That's how he describes tyrants. Yeah. Tyrants as werewolves, right? Yeah. And I think there is a point in that. Is this Trump, who was an entrepreneur and then sort of went into the entertainment business, but now the politics is a sort of true sphere where the werewolf can prosper, right? Because he has these people that sort of admire him and follow him unquestionably, and the power that it gives him is so important. So everybody is a free target, including the Pope.
Yeah, but he goes after one of the highest moral authority that we have in the world.
No, because he's the highest moral authority, and he is the sort of the figure in... So
gambling on a stock exchange?
Who is the Pope to question whatever? What Lars was already saying, right? You do not question me, right? No. Because as a stupid idiot, to go back to this thing, he's always right. Yeah. So if the Pope questions him, that shows that the Pope is wrong, right? Yeah. And then means the Pope can be attacked.
Yeah, as Trump has made very clear, he recognizes no norms, no limitations whatsoever outside of his own
except
morality.
His inner morality.
Yeah, which of course one would have to look pretty hard for. But it was also interesting that also Vice President Vance commented on this yesterday, in which he said that
because he's a Catholic.
Yeah, and he's a Catholic, and he said, "Oh well, I sort of like the Pope, but just like I, as Vice President, should be careful when discussing politics. The Pope should be careful when discussing theology." And I think that J.D. Vance giving the Pope advice on theology is a bit like me giving advice to Roger Federer about how to play tennis.
Okay, more about tennis and about things from your life in our second part of the show. We are close to the end to this part that we go on the televisions. Will be printed to the press. Will be on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. This is first podcast in English, so we'll have to subtitle it in Croatian. It'll be interesting. So we might get internationally recognized and banned probably from entering the United States for this. But okay, this is price of it. At least we enjoyed some great philosophy ideas today. But this is a last minute. Just I want to end this part of it, the TV, with what would Trump say of the philosophers at the end?
Oh, I actually wrote an afterword to the book about Trump and the philosophers, in which Trump passes judgment on the book preceding it, and he is not impressed. He refers to those 40 philosophers as 40 losers.
So Trumpish.
Yeah, they're just total losers. Nobody bothers to read them. They live miserable lives and so on. They've never built a hotel or a casino or a ballroom. And then he goes on to say that, well, they said I couldn't be re-elected. Total philosophical breakdown. I succeeded. I won. And of course, he has a point.
He did it.
Yeah.
And nobody believed it. And he did it.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go into more details in the second part. Thank you for joining us. Watch us on YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel by scanning the QR code that you see. And see you next Saturday in 7 days. Welcome to the second part of the podcast, Špica s Macanom, which you can watch only on the YouTube, so you have to subscribe to it, or you can listen to us on Spotify and Apple Podcast. So let's hear who our guests are. Lars Svendsen.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Bergen in Norway. I've written quite a few books on various topics.
Quite a few?
Yeah.
More than 20?
Yeah, something like that. The most recent one on stupidity, idiocy, and stupid idiots.
So this is the one that has been translated in Croatian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, Croatia is really my most faithful readers. There hasn't been more of my books translated to any other language than Croatian. So,
but we have to mention you have a great translator. For that you have to need to have a great translation.
Yeah.
Misho,
Kulenović,
yeah, somebody has to translate it from Norwegian to Croatian. It's not that often situation as some other languages.
Yeah. No, apart from that,
and great publisher, Diana.
Yeah, of course. Having have had a great relationship to Timpnes for a number of years now. So
it's more friendship, I would say, than
So I think this was my 6th time back now.
Okay.
So, and hopefully there will be more.
But you have a fun club also here.
Yeah, I mean, it's always so nice to find readers who get what you're doing and appreciate it. And I mean, there's no guarantee that when you write something that it will find an audience. You can just write it as you think it should be written and then hope for the best. Yeah. And
how is the reception in the rest of the world? Well, Croatia is obviously the most, the one that likes you the most. But how was the reaction in the other part of the world?
Well, all in all, it's pretty good. I mean, in total, there's been translations to 35 languages, which is a lot. So, and it's always surprising when, I sit there up north writing my little books, and then I get these emails from people in
Iran.
A lot of people from Iran. Have a lot of readers there, which was a great surprise to me. Yeah, we won't discuss who's the stupid idiot there. I think it's fairly clear. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And one thing that people don't. People usually ask about writing is how do you write it. So I was surprised that you told us that you write your first draft by hand. Yeah. The process when I write is always or almost always the same. I do a lot of reading, try to digest it, and then I think about it, and then at some point, hopefully, I understand what the book is supposed to be like. And I don't write until that I get that insight, until I get what the book should be like. But do you make notes in the meantime, or no? No. Of course, I write something in the margins of my books and the study and so on. But I don't take notes along the way. Try to keep it all in here, and then when I get the project, then I must have a good chunk of time, and then I sit down, stereo almost to the max. I also always have to have music on really loud when I write, creating a wall of sound between me and the surroundings. And then I write a first draft by hand really quickly. Usually, the actual writing part of it usually comes easy for me. And then when I've completed that first draft by hand, I go to the computer, I type it in, throw away approximately 1/3 of what's in the written draft, and then it's essentially finished. So that's how I do it every time, really. Okay. But also, what was your missed career? Was tennis playing? Yeah, when I was young, I hoped to become a good tennis player. unfortunately, I only became a capable tennis player. I played competitive tennis. My brother made the national team. I didn't. So when I was 17, I quit. I realized I'm not getting any better. I mean, I'm as good as I'll get, and that's not good enough. So then I left tennis and discovered books. I was probably the first person in my family to voluntarily open a book. I'm from completely non-academic background. My dad was a plumber. Mom and dad had 7 years of elementary school. It definitely wasn't in the cards that I should become a philosopher, but somehow that's how things ended up.
Yeah, but this is probably that's why you make this great connection with real life. That is, usually philosophers are not understood by others, and they discuss in between each other.
Yeah,
it's in the circles, but you're getting through to the people.
Yeah, but when after becoming properly educated as an academic philosopher, writing my doctoral dissertation and so on, I had a sort of philosophical crisis that I saw no point in what I was doing. Mm-hmm. I had lost the entire connection with all the reasons why I began studying philosophy in the first place. So I thought, I'll just leave this. I'll have to figure out something else to do. Maybe I can...
Plumbing?
I worked as a cleaner for a great number of years outside of school and my studies and so on. Maybe I can go back to being a cleaner or something. I can't do this philosophy thing anymore. And I was so bored. And of course, that became my first book. Because then I decided, okay, I'll write a book on boredom and I'll break all the rules that I had followed in my doctoral dissertation, trying to do this in a different way. And that worked for me. So that sort of saved philosophy for me. But it also told me that if I am to continue to do philosophy, I have to do it in that sort of way, with one foot in the academic world and one foot in the real world, so to speak. So that led to why I've written all these books in this manner. It's
and they're kind of smaller format, and they are affordable, so you can you don't have to bother.
Yeah, usually when I write a book, I think that I say to myself that it should be less than 200 pages. Because if it's more than 200 pages, I haven't thought it properly through. Then I need to do some more thinking in order to get it clear. 200 pages should be sufficient. Okay, I haven't followed that in all my books. So the books on evil, freedom, and the new one on Trump,
they deserve more pages.
Evil
and freedom
as
issues.
Yeah, I had to use more pages in those. And next fall I publish a even larger one, but that's a book that contains 100 short essays, so all devoted to one word each.
Okay.
Yeah,
it'll be interesting to read.
Yeah, but
like a dictionary of modern world or modern philosophy.
On what sort of person should I become?
Okay.
So the first word in Norwegian is recognition, and the last word is openness. So. Yeah, but for the most part, I think that 200 pages. If I can't make my case within that framework, I'll have to go back to the drawing board and think more carefully about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's hear something from Enes. So you have also written books, not that many, but
yes, not as many as Lars. I've published several books. In 7 edited volumes and university handbook, and I'm currently working on a book. Hopefully it's coming out this fall. It's about contemporary political theories and sort of ideologies that are kind of anti-liberal, illiberal, and trying to understand kind of the world we live today from the perspective of ideas that are circling around, and try to kind of give us a map of how did we, from sort of 90s, when we were kind of all young, and this triumph of liberal democracy, how did we end up in the world where even those who are dedicated liberal Democrats are kind of skeptical about the project, right? And looking at the people who have sometimes justifiably, sometimes unjustifiably, have sort of developed theories that oppose liberal democracy.
And
Will it be in English or Croatian?
No, it's in Croatian because, I mean, it's a good question. I publish a lot in English, mainly articles, but books, as a sort of a theorist that works at the University of Zagreb, I think we owe something to our own public, right? Not just to the, there are a lot of books in English, but we owe something to our own public. So I try, when I write a book, I often, not exclusively, there were some publications that were in English, but try to sort of direct it for, first and foremost, to the Croatian audience.
Hope that it gets
So I'm taking my students, and then from my students on, and my colleagues, and then maybe the wider audience.
I hope that it gets translated, because I'd like to read that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
and you're a professor at the...
I'm a professor at the University of Zagreb at the Faculty of Political Science. I've been there for over now 25 years. Yes, apart from that, I spent a lot of time abroad in the US, in the UK, where I studied, in Switzerland, in Germany, and so on. But again, decided to come back and continue my career in Croatia.
Yeah, but we are nearly the same age, all three of us. So
Possibly, yes.
early 70s.
And like Lars, I had at younger age, I had ideas of an alternative career. I wanted to be a musician, but again, I became a capable musician, but figured out that maybe there are people who are much more talented than me, and so decided for another strain of careers. Music is still very important in my life. That's why I went to ask Lars what's the music when he's writing that he's listening to. Still a very important part of my life, but more as a passion rather than the career.
So what are you listening to?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty broad, everything from black metal to Bach. But right now, I'm actually going through the entire Bach box on Deutsche Grammophon. That's 222 CDs of Bach. But then I have to take some breaks with some old electronics or black metal or whatever. Breaks in between all the Bach. But music is probably my biggest interest, bigger than philosophy, which is why I refuse to write about music. I wish to keep that as a pure sphere, not make work out of it. So I never write about music.
Okay, I think we still owe that part of discussion on education. That's why we have you here, Enes. So as I said, we are roughly the same age, beginning of the 70s, and we've been through the probably happy times. We lived probably the best times we could with the. The wall falling down in Berlin and everything, living peacefully. And now all of a sudden...
Through the best of times and worst of times, right? Yeah. We did live, as young people, we did live through the war.
Through the war, yes.
Through the war, yes. But even during the war, we can say there were some, very bad things happening, but there were also some good times when you were a young person there and sort of developing yourself and trying to understand the world.
Okay, so
it's not all dark.
No, it's I look at it very positive, kind of. Though we went through the war in this part of Europe, and so we know what the war is. So when we saw the war in Ukraine and whatever is happening now in Iran, we know that war is not good.
Yes, I think it gives us a perspective. Yeah. If you lived through the war, it gives you a certain.
You don't want to start another one, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but what is the difference now between us, our generations? I wanted to learn. I was curious. I was. So what's the key difference now when you see with the students and what they want to achieve? And is education kind of part of where we could jump in and make them more critical of the stupid idiots, or how to open their brains, or they are not really ready to get, they don't want that?
That's a great question, because as I said, I have over 20 years of career in teaching, so you inevitably ask yourself, are you connecting with this? Does it make sense, right? And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you come from work very, very depressed, but sometimes you click and does. But I don't want to be one of those sort of older, or in this case, middle-aged professor who are like, in my times, it was so great. We were so open and critical, and new generations. Yeah. But I think also it's worth noting there are some changes, some positive and some negative with new generations. So one difference I see is with my students, it's a bit more work, not all, I'm generalizing here, there are always different students in each generation. It's a bit more harder to make them convinced that you should read interesting theoretical text, like read a Plato's dialogue, 30 pages, 40 pages, sometimes it's longer. They have a bit of a hard time sitting down and peacefully reading the text.
They would
because
like
I think their world is much faster.
They would like ChatGPT to summarize it to them.
That's another problem. So yeah, I think I always tell my students, you think faster than I do, right? But sometimes thinking too fast is sometimes you need to slow down, right? When you're reading classical texts, you need to kind of slow down and take it slow. It's kind of when you're eating a nice meal, not everything is fast food. Or sometimes you have to kind of sit down and eat it. And then there's a problem that you mentioned, right? Which we're all kind of struggling. And to tell you the truth, we don't yet have a proper answer, or I don't think we have a proper answer, which is this shortcut of maybe using ChatGPT and other instruments like that, where if they don't find the task, I found that if students find the task interesting, they will not use these shortcuts. They will devote themselves to it. But if they just think it's a task, something they just have to do, then they will, even sometimes very smart students and good students will take this shortcut. And we haven't yet, or maybe Lars has an answer, I don't, we haven't yet come up with adequate answer, apart from trying to convince the students that it is in their own benefit, right? Yeah. To try not to use it, right? To say, okay, there is this tool, right? But there are benefits from not trying to use it. So it is a challenge. I think it might be the biggest. You said we had pretty good sort of lives, and I agree with it. But it's probably the biggest challenge as far as not only education, but what we are now discussing is education. Biggest challenge in education in, I would venture to say, in more maybe than 50, 60 years.
Yeah. I mean, I tell my students that studying is a bit like going to the gym. And simply to type in a prompt, then get a reply, and then submit that, is a bit like going to the gym and then pay somebody else to push the weights for you. Yes. Because the whole point of going to the gym is, of course, to meet a specific form of resistance that helps you build muscle, endurance, and so on. And the same with training your capacity for thinking. My experience is that the really good students, they are as good as they used to be.
That's true.
Yeah,
I agree.
Sure. But there is a problem with getting them to read longer, complex texts, and they're more clueless in a way than students used to be. They're used to getting things prepared for them. They're more used to having exact instructions on exactly what they should do, and
not more than that.
Yeah, but the sort of independent rumination, trying to find one's way about in this field and so on. That is more missing.
And also failing and trying again.
Yeah.
Because failing is a very important part of education. Yeah, and I agree with Lars.
Do they want to fail? No, they don't.
They seem to be slightly less tolerant towards failing. They want, and I think that is kind of the world. I mean, now to be fair, that's the world we created, right? We created the world where it's expected to be successful is not to fail, and then they look at it, and in this world we have to use means that make it easier not to fail.
Yeah,
I think failing is in intellectual endeavor or being in the gym is an important thing, that you feel that, because if you don't fail, then you don't see the goal that you need to achieve. You need to see the goal and know that it's hard to achieve because you can fail, and you failed over and over again.
Yeah, but that being said, I mean, ChatGPT and Claude and so on, brilliant tools if you just use them properly. And if students, for instance, use them to engage in some sort of dialogue, going back and forth and so on, all is well. It's rather than when you reduce them to being a supplier of answers rather than a discussion partner, that's when you're led astray. But I don't think we should dismiss these tools.
No way.
That would be a bit like repeating Plato's old criticism of writing, which of course he believed would lead to the total corruption of thinking, relying on this weird thing called writing. So we shouldn't go down that path, but they're having problems at the moment with figuring out how to deal with this in an educational context.
Yeah, but do we get them to be thinking critically? Do you think that we are losing that battle, or they're just know to do it in specific things that they are really interested in? But do they get critical of life? Are they going to be modern political citizens able to vote?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, Lars pointed out, of course, there are these smart students who know what the dangers are. They understand the dangers. Philosophy here in theory is specific because there are different types of knowledge, right? Yeah. And so one of them is, and this is where they usually like, it's just, okay, these are the facts, so this helps me to kind of summarize the facts, right? That's not the point of philosophy, right? It doesn't matter. I told them it doesn't matter if you know when Plato was born. I mean, it's nice if you know when Plato was born, or the name of all his dialogues, right? What Plato is teaching you, right? I mean, today when you read Plato, you read it, and that's, I think, a great thing. He's wrong about most stuff. It doesn't matter. He's teaching you how to think, how to approach things, and sometimes you'll get it wrong, sometimes you get it right, sometimes you'll get it, you don't even know it's wrong and right, which is, I think, the most rewarding. And that's, in that discipline, is what is important that the students absorb. However, when it comes just to sort of absorbing a lot of facts, that being said, right, to do critical thinking, you do need some kind of a platform to stand on. Right? You can't just start doing thinking and questioning stuff, because as we talked before, you end up with conspiracy theories or stupid idiots and so on. If you think, you do need to inform yourself first. So I tell them, well, read it. Maybe it's all wrong, right? Read it, but then you will develop and say, okay, I think this Plato is wrong in this dialogue. Let's say the dialogue against the writing, and he did also write. I mean, he write in dialogue form, but he did write. So there is a sort of paradox there. But then I always tell them, these are great thinkers, but they're not great thinkers because you want to idolize them and absorb what they say and then just repeat what they said. They're great thinkers because they were often wrong, and they make you think why they were wrong and help you develop. And that's a specific thing, but that's one niche of knowledge. There are many, medical science and so on. That's where I think the real danger. We might have a kind of an easier task, because people who understand what we're doing when you're doing philosophy or political theory, they understand that this is what you're doing. But in medical science or in some different sciences or economics and so on, once they think it's just about absorbing as much information and trying to repeat that information without losing that's where I think the real danger lies. So I think that the real danger will be in those disciplines.
Okay, and one thing that I probably should have asked more in the first half, but it's still very interesting going back to Machiavelli or ethics in ethics and politics that you're both doing. Mm-hmm. How much is ethical what we see happening, that actually 15 minutes before war announcement somebody buys oil, invests, makes bets, earns millions, billions, and America was at least known for their check and balances and what you shouldn't be doing. And there is, they say Trump is doing it. They said that husband of Pelosi was doing it, but where we got lost in that, because I always had that inspiration in America, in those anti rules, anti-corruption rules, how you should run the market, not privileged information or whatever. All of that seems to be gone.
Yeah.
One of the most famous Plato's dialogues, right, The Republic, starts with Socrates as the main character discussing with an old arms dealer, right? And what happens is that arms dealer, who is reaching a rich life, Socrates is always sort of poor, but the arms dealer, he's rich, they're meeting in his house, the house is beautiful, right? And then at the beginning, right, that there's this clash of, he's telling Socrates, you live the poor life, right? Look at you. I mean, you barely have clothes to put on yourself. And look at my rich house. And Socrates, of course, is countering that, right? So that arms dealer would be an example of the contemporary people who make money on misery, on war, and so on, make profits from oil sales and so on. So the question is, but interestingly, then it ends with this arms dealer worried what the gods will think, because he's old like Socrates and the death is coming, and at the end he asks himself, what will gods think? And he's trying, because he's an arms dealer, everything is about profit, he's trying to then bribe the gods, right? He's going for a sacrifice, bribe the gods so that when he dies, the gods will cherish him, right? And then you hear right away this tension. You said, is it ethical? Well, do you have the ethics of Socrates, as we like to think, or do you have the ethics of the arms dealer, right? But this uneasiness that the arms dealer in this first part of the dialogue is uneasy. He's deeply unsure, right? that he actually lived, he justified it with profit, with his, he wasn't a loser. Socrates is a loser. And that is the question. And now it seems that if part of the MAGA movement, that is the ethics. The ethics is don't be to be loser. That's what's immoral.
The only ethic that works is don't be loser.
The only thing is the success. So if you're successful, then you have lived the full life.
Yeah, but you had the prosecutors investigating the inside trading that they were reduced to 2 people. You put your guy to the Security Exchange Commission. You put your guy to FCC. So if somebody is making fun of you, you remove him from the program, or you control whatever businesses are happening. And just talking about interest being taken there for bringing TikTok to somebody, whatever. He's doing business deals while being a president.
Yeah.
And that's so blatant. So he doesn't even try to hide it.
No.
Yeah, because only in his mind, only the loser wouldn't do that.
Yeah. Really. I mean, there is a distinction here to be drawn between winners and losers. In fact, it's the only relevant distinction to be drawn from that perspective. And the sort of uneasiness the arms dealer in Play-Doh feels, there's no uneasiness, there's no inner conflicts. And what's also so striking...
There is no conflict of interest.
There's definitely a conflict of interest, but there's no moral conflict.
Although Trump did say at one point that he's not sure what happens when he dies. If he'll go to heaven, probably not, he said.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to worry him too much.
Yeah, but of course we're used to talking about Putin's Russia as a kleptocracy. Of course, the US at present is a kleptocracy. Yeah. And the systematic dismantling of all checks and balances in this field during the Trump administration has been simply staggering. But
it's not only Trump, it's these what we call sort of technocratic titans, right? The titans of recently you had a New Yorker article published on Sam Altman, who was a head of the company that produces ChatGPT and so on. And you can see in them, I mean, undoubtedly people who are talented, right, who have a certain vision and so on, but also this kind of ethics of success and everything, like and lying and deceiving and all, but again, what's missing is the bigger picture. We can go back to Machiavelli, Gloria, right? I mean, you can be the biggest winner and most successful in the world,
richest man in the world.
But if the world is burning and the world is not there anymore, right?
You made the world miserable with the social networks. For example, you could be the richest man in the world, but your social networks made the world miserable.
They think they didn't make their own world miserable because their world is better. But you are part of the world, and I think what they lack is this, that you see beyond the point of just your own personal interest. And that's when we talk about sort of Socrates ethics, is that there is a world of value beyond you.
Yeah, but is there any chance that we, as Europe, try to regulate them who want to be deregulated fully?
We are. That's their problem with the European Union, right? Because European Union is in large part regulating both the use of
private data
and so on. And that's why often, if, for example, you go on an American website and you're not ready to confirm everything, they won't allow you even to access the data because we're within the European Union, and in that sense, they're trying to regulate it. Is it always the policies that are put in place, are they always correct or not correct? That's up to debate. But I think once a new technology comes in and you can see it has bad, not just social impact, but economic impact and impact for the whole society, then of course there's a impetus to regulate it. And then the question is, how do we regulate it correctly? Should the children be banned from social media like in Australia now, in 16 or not? I mean, that's a debate, right? But it's a legitimate debate. We know that there is a danger there. Saying outright that that's kind of a violation of freedoms or that's dangerous just as a thought to regulate these things, I think that's incorrect.
Something to close up, Lars?
No, I mean, lots of new problems that have popped up now. Because, for instance, if we look at the history of the concept of rule of law, it was typically oriented towards the state or the ruler, the prince, the tyrant, whatever, as the threat. And now with the emergence of all these tech oligarchs, they pose a similar sort of threat, but we haven't yet developed the theories to deal with that threat. So we'll definitely have some serious thinking to do. with regards to how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to regulate this?
Unless it's too late.
There's great need for a philosophical update.
Yeah, unless it's too late, if they take too much power.
Yeah. Too late. I mean, that will have to be seen. I often say that such matters as truth, justice, and so on, it's not just something that's given to us or denied us. They're tasks for us, something we must aim to achieve, knowing very well that we will often fail. But I mean, the fact that we often fail is no argument against trying our best to do so.
Okay, we'll stop here. So thank you. We come to an end of another episode of the podcast, Špica s Macanom. I invite you to subscribe you on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcast, so you don't miss any upcoming or see the previous ones. We had a good one on polarization. That was also a huge hit. I trust that, I believe that this one will be also one that will be watched and transmitted all over the world. Leave us your comments and let us inform more what are your preferences regarding our future guests. So see you at Špica next Saturday at 10 a.m.